अस्सलाम वालेकुम नाज़रीन, DTVNN के साथ मैं हूँ किरण खान। आए नज़र डालते हैं आज की खुसूसी रिपोर्ट की जानिब। इलेक्शन 2024 के हवाले से HEM ब्रीफिंग का एहतमाम किया गया, जिसका मौजू था कि वोट कौन देता है, एथनिक वोट कितना बड़ा है, लॉन्ग टर्म वोटिंग के ट्रेंड्स क्या हैं। आइए देखते हैं इस ब्रीफिंग में क्या क्या कहा गया।
Welcome to today's online call, a conference call with Houston Ethnic Media, hosted by Ethnic Media Services. I'm Sandy Close, Director of EMS, and your moderator for today. Our conference spotlights the first of 3 Houston Ethnic Media briefings about the 2024 elections. Who votes? How big is the ethnic vote? What are the long-term voting trends? These are the broad themes we're looking at today. This first of 3 briefings will feature 3 experts who will map the landscape of voters in Greater Houston and at the state level, dive deeper into the role of ethnic voters, and provide an overview of long-term voter engagement trends. We are holding this briefing online rather than on site to accommodate the power grid disruptions earlier this month. We look forward to resuming our on-site briefings in the coming month. Our speakers today include Renee Cross, Senior Executive Director and Researcher at the Hobby School of Public Affairs, the University of Houston. Hector De Leon, Senior Advisor, Governmental Affairs and Public Engagement, the Harris County Clerk's Office. And Michael Adams, Director, Master of Public Affairs of the Graduate Program at TSU's Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs. And these quick snapshot summaries don't do justice to the extensive expertise and careers of our 3 speakers. We will be sending you longer bios of each speaker after today's call. A note of thanks to the Houston Endowment for supporting today's conference, and to all of you for joining us. We'll be sending a recording of the session, and if you have questions for the speakers, please enter them in the chat. We encourage our speakers to monitor the questions on the chat and respond as you think will be most relevant to your field. We start today's briefing with Renee Cross. Ms. Cross, welcome. Thank you for laying the foundations for today's briefing.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here. And please don't call me Miss Cross. Just call me Renee, everyone.
Will do.
But at least you didn't call me Mrs. Cross. That was an evil mother-in-law. But I digress. Most of you guys, if not all, I believe, are very familiar with the political landscape in Houston. So some of the things that I may discuss may be a little bit redundant, but I'm going to go ahead and set the stage for my colleagues, Hector and Michael. As you guys know, Harris County is huge by any measure. The county itself is larger than 26 states. And as far as registered voters go, we have more than 2.6 million registered voters in Harris County. So again, we're talking huge numbers. You'll also, particularly if you are registered to vote in Texas, you may be aware that we tend to have a lot of elections in Texas. I could spend a whole hour talking about why that is, but we'll save that history lesson for another time. But in the Harris County area, just in the last 8 months, we've had 6 elections, and Hector can correct me if there was a 7th one that squeezed in there. But that's a lot of elections in a short period of time, and it's a lot of responsibility that we put on our voters. As such, we oftentimes are disappointed in our voter turnout. For example, in fall 2023, we had an open mayoral seat, which is a pretty big deal in Houston. And even with that open seat, our voter participation rate was at 22%. Not something necessarily to brag about. And of course, in the December runoff, that number dropped even further. We had a primary in Texas in March. And again, numbers don't look really good. And I say that in comparison to other states, other cities in the country. In Harris County alone, during the March primaries, we had about 14% turnout. Now, keep in mind that, yes, at least at the time, we thought we knew who was going to be heading the presidential ticket, but we had a very open race for our Democratic nominee for U.S. Senator. But even with that, and particularly the Democratic primary, we saw single-digit turnout. We get excited because we think, well, the larger the election, national election, a presidential year, our turnout will increase, which is true. And we were very excited in 2020 when Texas broke the 60% participation rate. However, that still runs 10 to 20 points lower than some other states. There are various factors of why we have low turnout in the Houston area and in Texas as a whole. Electoral competitiveness is certainly a huge factor. Our districts are very, very gerrymandered here. There's not a whole lot of competition, so people don't get very excited. Again, we elect everybody for everything, including dog catchers. So we have a ton of elections. People get worn out. Even my most civically committed friends this last spring and this early summer, it was just like they were over it. We have so many elections here. People often cite various voting laws as being a deterrent to voting. Whether or not that may be reality, certainly the perception of some of our voter laws can again suppress turnout. Our population in Houston is younger than the average voter age and otherwise. And we know that the younger the voter, the less likely they are to vote. Income is a factor in voter participation. The more wealthy you are, the more likely you are to vote. In Houston, Harris County, our income levels are lower than some other metropolitan areas in the United States. And simply generation makes a huge difference in voting and your propensity to vote. For example, if my parents were immigrants, which actually one of them was, but if your parents were immigrants or were not eligible to vote when you were young and coming of age, more likely you may not be in that pattern of voting consistently. That sometimes takes 2 to 3 generations. And of course, as we know, and a fact that we're very proud of, Houston is the most diverse city in the United States. So we do have a lot of immigrants, a lot of first generation Americans, a lot of naturalized Americans. They may need a little bit more from us as educators, as researchers, as communicators in providing information to them on the ins and outs of voting. Now, I sound very gloom and doom. Sorry about that. However, I think with recent developments in our national election, there appears to be some excitement. In fact, vote.org just reported that they had more than 100,000 people register to vote just since President Biden's announcement. And that's only through their portal. And the 48 hours from that announcement, there was nearly 40,000 registered, which, of course, for us that are political junkies and that want to see our young folks in particular voting, this is welcome news. However, that also puts pressure on us. And I say that as a collective us, because, you know, again, as educators, researchers, and communicators, we provide much of the information to our voters, especially our young voters. So it's a huge responsibility for all of us to carry. But before we can communicate about the issues and the candidates, we really need to know who these voters are and how to target them. So in an effort to, I guess, further define who our voters are in the Harris County area, I'm going to turn this over to Hector, who's going to be able to explain to you in much more detail what the Harris County electorate looks like, and particularly when we're looking at various demographics such as gender, race, and ethnicity.
That's great, Renee. You had originally spoken about the survey you took Texas-wide. Could we come back to you?
Yes.
Ask you for that bookend, but this is a great overview of the demographic voting trends. Thank you. And
sure.
Now we go to Hector de Leon, who will drill deeper into the diversity of voters and the role of ethnic voters. Thank you, Hector.
Well, thank you. Before anything, I just wanted to provide a little background. I joined the county in 2004, and I've been an elections official since, except for, I think, 2.5 years, from 2001 to 2000. Yeah, about a year and a half, I think. And prior to working with the county, I worked in the community for 15 years. I actually led the educational fund for the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, which is the acronym is NALEO, here in Texas. So I led it for over a decade here in Texas, based in Houston. So I worked in engaging the Latino Hispanic community, Houston, surrounding area, and throughout Texas, helping legal permanent residents apply for citizenship. So I started a mobilization program in conjunction with Univision, and I work with Telemundo too, to engage the Latino community in voting, or at least to provide the rudimentary elements of voting. When do you register? What kind of methods can you utilize to vote in Texas? Mail, early voting, election day voting. So we created a program to do that. I left NALEO, joined the county to implement a language assistance program for the county, where we were engaging communities that are covered by the language provisions of the Voting Rights Act, Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, 1975 Voting Rights Act, where if a certain minority language group is covered, I mean, the census will let us know. The DOJ will let us know at a certain point. I think they used to do it every 10 years. Now they're doing it twice a decade, after the census and then mid-decade via the American Community Survey data. Will they let you know if another language has hit the benchmark to be able to be covered by the language provisions, which means that if they do say they are, then each election office, the election office has to provide everything that has to do with elections in that language. In English, currently we have English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Chinese that are covered here in Harris County. What will happen next? The next largest population, probably aside from those, are actually the Filipinos. But I have found that most Filipinos that come to the United States already come speaking English. So they may not. In fact, one of the largest communities, the largest Asian, Southeast Asian community in Harris County is actually the Indian population, but they have not met the benchmark that is required to be able to provide the ballot in a specific language because, again, most of the folks probably that immigrate from India, many of them, probably a majority of them actually speak English. Actually, as we know that the English colonized India and they still, that's the remnants of that most of them speak English when they come to the United States. So now, so I've done a lot of research pertaining to people who are registered to vote in Harris County because it was part of our language assistance program. The DOJ provided us with surname glossaries where we had to find out where the Vietnamese surname registered voters were, the Spanish surname registered voters, Chinese surname registered voters. So then we could target them to provide the essential information that is needed to access the voting process. So from that, I can tell you that I run queries, and most recently, the July voter roll here in Harris County shows that Spanish surnames comprise 25% of the registered voters here in Harris County. Asian, in general, Asian surnames comprise about 5%. So that's like 30%, going on maybe 31%. So that means the rest of the registered voters are not English, not Spanish surnames and not Asian surnames, which is still substantial, but it broken up between other groups like African Americans and what the census called white alone population. So at this point, one of the things that we need to know from doing that, and people will say, well, if you're familiar with Harris County in Texas, there's always a mistake that is made by, I don't think the media necessarily makes it, is that the way the Hispanic leadership and other political analysts or election analysts talk about the electorate. And what they do is they begin by citing population. Harris County's population is 45, going on 50%. Harris County's Hispanic population is about 45, going on 50% of the population here in Harris County. So everybody always emphasizes that number. So what that does, and has been doing since the census introduced Hispanic into the census form, is that immediately everybody thinks that that percent of population actually reflects the size of the Hispanic electorate. And that narrative, that premise, since it started, is completely false, is wrong. The idea, and it is something that is very important for ethnic media, the metaphor of the sleeping giant is not only derogatory, but is wrong. It is wrong because Latinos may be 45% or 46% of the population here in Harris County, but of the citizen voting age population, it is 32%, according to the American Community Survey. In Texas, it's 32% also. So, and when you actually break it down by city, in the city of Houston, it is 32% of the citizen voting age population, meaning the persons that are 18 years of age and are eligible to register to vote, is 32% in the city of Houston, 32% county-wide here in Harris County, the third largest county in the nation, and it is 32% statewide. But when it comes to the actual number of registered voters, I imagine that what I find here through surname data here in Harris County is the same, probably statewide. And you could probably add 3 points for folks who may not have a Spanish surname here, because we do know that the Latino community is very diverse. So when it comes to number of registered voters, we actually are not doing that badly. It's just that the narratives that people push are not based on the kind of research and analysis that I've done. I don't expect everybody else to have done it. So they speak generally using narratives that are found in the media, and they take what the media says as gospel, and in reality, that gospel is not accurate. The narratives don't match the truth.
Could I just clarify that? So you're saying 32% of citizen voting age population in Harris County is Hispanic. Right. Of that, 25% are actually Spanish surname registered.
No, of the whole registered voter roll in Harris County, okay, Spanish surnames comprise 25%.
Okay.
They comprise 32% of the citizen voting age population. So 25% of all registered voters in Harris County are Spanish surnames.
Got it.
Yeah.
But 32% are eligible to vote?
According to the American Community Survey.
Okay, great. And would you have numbers for Asians? You said 5% Asian surname.
I have that data somewhere. The population is actually, I think, pushing 8%, but the actual surname count shows that there may be like 4% of this the registered voters, 4 or 5%. So that's like 30% of all registered voters in Harris County may be, according to surname data, is Hispanic and Asian.
And are you seeing those numbers going up?
It's going up steadily. It's going up. When I look at the data, it actually paints a more positive picture, because I hear too many people saying that somehow people are not voting. But one of the things that I found out in working in elections is that each state has its own election code, and the election code is impacted by the Voting Rights Act. What that means is that how you define who is a registered voter varies in every state. In voting rights states, contrary to the popular narratives, it is very, very difficult to kick somebody off the voter roll. So then what happens is that when there's an election and there's, let's say there's 100 people registered to vote, and 6 people, it says, well, Harris County only voted 60%. Previous to the 2020 election, 2020, the turnout was 66, 67% in Harris County. It's the highest ever. Previous to that, it was like in the 60s, 61, 62, around there in presidential elections, at least in recent presidential elections. But on the voter roll, there's various classifications. They either put a nay on you, active registered voter, or they put an S, means suspense. It doesn't mean suspended. It means suspense, meaning that when they sent you the voter registration certificate, it came back to them, so they don't know where you are. So you're out there in limbo. But if an election came, you could actually show up to the poll, present your identification, and complete what they call a statement of residence, updating your residence information, and you can vote. But when you actually calculate how many people that have a nest, it could range between 100 to 250,000 people. So when you actually calculate, if you were to take out all the people with a nest on the voter roll and only calculated the people who voted, and one, divide into the other, the actual turnout goes from 7 to 10 points. It jumps up. For example, if the turnout in 2012 was 60%, when you don't use the number of suspense voters in the calculation, the turnout percent jumps up 7 to 10 points. That means they would be in 67% or 70%.
Okay.
So those issues pertaining to turnout, the media needs to understand that each state defines what a registered voter is and how they use that information that has an impact on calculating voter turnout in each state. So that has an impact on whether a state has a high voter turnout or a lower voter turnout perceptively. Because you can see it. And it also it tells you a little bit about each state. For example, you go to LA County or Harris County, their voter turnout is going to be lower. Why do you think? Because the largest plurality of their population, half of it is eligible to vote.
Right. That's really a very important theme that you're introducing, that our narratives are often completely out of sync with the actual data. So let us come back to you. I want to go to our third speaker and then open this up for real discussion and conversation. Thank you very much, Mr. De Leon. Hector. Now we go to Michael Adams with the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs at TSU. You need to unmute.
All right, I'm done.
Yeah,
thank you for having me today with this interesting audience. And I have to say from the outset, you could not have selected a better panel, because the two individuals who are here, they drive and they give my work a lot of credibility. And what I will focus on in this presentation, we're talking about trends in terms of voting. I will look at the African-American community through the lens of the last two mayoral elections or municipal elections. And again, Hector is my resource for a lot of the data in terms of the percentages, who's voting, in terms of the demographics. And he shared with me in terms of looking at the zip codes, for example, and 95% or more of the minority or Black population, where Blacks are the majority, voter turnout was down by 21%. But the caveat is that Hector has already mentioned the community surveys may not always be accurate, because we've had population shifts, in particular as it relates to African Americans voters. If you take the Houston areas, we've seen a lot of movement of Blacks to Fort Bend County, out of the city, and also to Brazoria County. Now, what does that portend in terms of voting trends? Well, I think there will be some externalities or carryover effects that will impact those areas in terms of the movement of more Blacks into Pearland. You can expect to have more people of color, or Blacks in particular, who may be elected to office. because again, we have to look at percentages, and there's the whole notion of descriptive representation or substantive representation. And over the years, we've looked at the districts in terms of the population. If it's at a certain population threshold, 6%, for example, well, it's a good place where there's a safe or a good possibility that a Black candidate or a minority candidate from that ethnic group can be elected. So that's there. Similarly, I think we see some trends, and I want to look at the city of Houston and also the APEC, the Asian Pacific Islander community. We have, I think, 3 city council districts that we need to pay close attention to, and Hector can come back and give us the data in terms of who's voting. But if you look at District F, that is represented by Tiffany Thomas, well, you can't say she's a Black woman, but she has to have what I would label as some crossover appeal. And if you look at some of the policies and some of the issues, whether it's transportation, the same thing I would say for City Council Member Pollard, who represents District J. That district, you can't say that's a solidly Black, although he's an African-American person. You will hear him arguing for a kind of international kind of community. You may recall when the mayor came out and said, we don't need to run metro buses in this area because something about the Galleria, but Pollard came back. And so you will see these candidates shift based upon the shift in voting patterns to articulate certain things. You could suggest that substantive policy will shift as opposed to having a minority or a Black agenda. You have to appeal to a wider group. And I think that's important. The same thing could be said for District K in terms of Martha Tatum, who is, I think, is the vice mayor, and certainly having that kind of appeal where you can appeal to a broader base that expands the base for what we've seen in terms of the Black elected officials. And I think that needs to be pointed out if we're going to talk about trends. Now, we still tend to see what I will describe as racially correlated voting in a mild sense, but it used to refer to, Renee talked about voter suppression at the top of the conversation as racially polarized voting. We see a lot of this in many instances in some of the races. If you look specifically at the council districts, District B and District D, where you'll have the largest Black population or African-American population, if you will, they will normally coalesce around the Black candidate. And if we look at the last elections, clearly Sheila Jackson Lee received the majority of votes out of those 2 districts. However, I think compared to go back to 2015, when we had an open seat where Mayor Turner ran against Bill King, you will see in this instance that the Anglo candidate, Whitmire, actually he got a significant number of Black votes out of those 2 particular districts. And also we saw a number of African-American elected officials who supported the Anglo mayor. Now, whether we are progressing, moving out of this kind of racially correlated pattern, I've given 2 instances. I think in certain parts of the city of Houston clearly could be defined in terms of what our population looked like as an international zone. I would also like to comment in terms of the trends Renee talked about gerrymandering. If we had fair maps, we could argue there's a rule that should be the whole county rule, and where you create a congressional district based on the county. If you look at Fort Bend County, certainly that could be a kind of minority district if we had a fair map. But right now, Representative Nails represents that district. And even if the maps are drawn, I think there was a trade-off. If you look at the district that was designed to show up Wesley Hunt's district, and it was carved up the districts in and around the Galleria area. But we could have had what you call a community of interest based upon an international appeal, if you will. That district could have started from the Galleria area all the way out to the Sharpstown area, in and around where we see large pockets of African immigrants, and you could have had what we call a kind of international districts. And that's one of the rules of what the plan should be about when you talk about community of interest. So why not speak about or look at a community of interest in terms of reflecting the international flavor of what we've seen in the city of Houston? So I think we've gotten beyond the point of hopefully whether it's positive to talk about descriptive representation or even symbolic representation, where we would talk about whether or not there are public policy issues that are there, whether we're looking at the municipal level in terms of ordinance and the impact. Now, the other thing we have to talk about in these games, we know that in the metropolitan areas of the state of Texas, if you look at the Houston Metroplex, or if you look at DFW, the Metroplex, and in and around the San Antonio area, everything else outside of that is basically what we could describe as being ruby red. And we have seen this impact in terms of looking at the legislature. And Hector works in an office where they came back, they have to take on the election. But we had an election administrator, regardless of your position on that, but we saw the state legislature come back and enact a law, for example. So we have seen gains within the municipalities, and also some of the things that, quote unquote, where some people will define as progressive, again, based upon where you stand on the political spectrum. And I'll leave that to you. But we've seen this battle between Austin and these areas where we see large populations of minority or ethnic people living, and where they have the population numbers to elect a majority of the county commissioners court or have a majority that's representing their interests on city council. I'll stop at that point.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And this is a perfect segue to go back to Renee with the voter survey you and colleagues just completed on Texas as a whole. How would you sort of describe the landscape of voter participation in Texas as a whole based on your last survey, and any information you can break down, in fact, any of our speakers, on the Asian American, Pacific American vote would also be very helpful.
First of all, let me tell Michael, jump in anytime here. This recent poll is a collaboration between University of Houston and Texas Southern. And Michael and I worked together on this survey. This survey was fielded in late June, last week of June. And, you know, there's been a few things that have happened since then. So keep that in the back of your mind when I discuss some of these results. Looking, again, statewide, former President Trump garnered 49% support compared to 40% for Biden. This is exactly the same numbers that we saw back when we did this survey in January. So there wasn't a whole lot of movement there. Again, this is the last week of June. Now, when we looked at the U.S. Senate race, Senator Cruz was leading at 47% against Colin Allred at 44%. So we have an incumbent senator at only a 3% advantage. I should point out that the margin of error for this particular survey is 2.5%. So, you know, our new Democratic nominee is certainly providing some competition for Senator Cruz. The top issues statewide are, to our likely voters, are immigration, the economy, and inflation. When we break down these opinions by favorability, and this one I can go into a little bit more detail about Kamala Harris. Now, again, last week of June, so with her new role, we would expect her to have somewhat of a jump or a bump in these numbers. You could also possibly say that for former President Trump due to the assassination attempt. Sometimes those type of events can give a candidate a bump in public opinion. But as it stood the last week of June, among Black likely voters, 81% had a favorable opinion of Kamala Harris. This is a big difference of opinion when it comes to President Trump among likely Black voters in Texas. Only 22% had a favorable opinion of former President Trump. Latino voters, it was much tighter. However, Kamala Harris had 47% favorable ratings compared to 43%. When we look at generations, Ms. Harris has an advantage among Generation Z voters. 50% had a favorable opinion of her compared to 43% for Trump. Similar numbers among millennial voters. Harris was on the top with 49% favorable compared to 45% for Trump. Other demographic breakdowns are more or less probably what you would expect in the state of Texas. For example, among women, Trump has a favorable rating of 47%, Harris at 44%. Among men, Trump has a favorable rating of 54% compared to 42% for Harris. We are actually going back into the field probably early next week. So we expect that some of these numbers will shift considerably because of recent events. I also want to let you guys know that if any of you are not getting media releases from the hobby school or the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School, please let us know. You can email me and or Michael, and we'll make sure that you get on these distribution lists.
Right.
Our reports are all online at uh.edu/hobby, HOBBY. If you don't see, say, a statistic that you're particularly interested in, we may or may not be able to come to create that for you, but be sure and reach out to us anytime on any of these reports. And Michael, I rambled on, so jump in.
No, I was just like to add in terms of course, there's no expectation that Kamala Harris will win Texas, but we have to talk about the coattail effect in terms of down ballots, not only in Texas, what it pretends in terms of keeping or trying to gain control of the House of Representatives for the Democrats, and also to hang on to the Senate, because again, the Senate is looking kind of iffy with Manchin stepping down, and in West Virginia, you probably will elect a Republican. But I was glad to see Colin Allred in Houston over the weekend. Now, he didn't come out immediately and endorse Vice President Harris. But again, you can't run a kind of middle-of-the-road campaign. And I think if she's able to drive the voter turnout, in particular with young people, and we saw Ted Cruz had a very close race with Beto O'Rourke. And so, again, I think we have to look down ballot, and we have to think nationally, looking at the impact of having Kamala Harris on the ballot as opposed to Biden, in terms of ginning up voter turnout. And what I missed in my earlier presentation, looking at the age cohorts, there are a great deal of concern. I'm working as a consultant for some political action committees here in the Houston area along with what we call the Divine Nine. That's a group of fraternities and sororities. The emphasis here is to increase the voter turnout, in particular amongst younger voters between the ages of 18 and 29, because again, those percentages are very low. And what we did not point out, and Hector can bear me out on this, who votes? We're talking about people between the ages of 60, 65, and 79 years of age. If we look at the percentages, and they were all like in the 40% or 39 percentile, these are the people who are turning out to vote. So messaging may be important. How do you reach younger voters? We know in 2016, we had university students still in the burn. The same thing in 2020 in terms of driving that vote. What impact will Kamala Harris have on these voters, if any?
I'd like to ask Hector, in terms of identifying who votes, you have enormously diverse populations that fall into the category of Asian and of Black. But within these groups, you have growing populations of African diaspora, and of course, growing populations of South Asians, Burmese, Nepalese. How do we, if we're running an outlet serving specific ethnic groups, how do we find a way to calculate voter turnout within our specific ethnic group? Is it possible?
It's possible to do estimates through surnames, but that is not an exact science, but because the populations are too small. But for example, I was going to make the point that the professor pointed something out about voting and the ages. It's very important that young people vote, in particular among Hispanics, because 57% of all Spanish surname registered voters here in Harris County, and I'm probably pretty sure that this is reflected statewide, 57% of all Spanish surname registered voters are 43 years of age or younger. 43 years of age or younger among, and we can say Hispanics. And when you actually look at the registered voter numbers from 18 to 24 currently, Spanish surnames comprise 37% of the registered voters between the ages of 18 to 24 years old. Asian surnames only 4%, and then the rest is 59%, which is split among the not Spanish surname and not Asian. But getting back to the Asian question, some of the populations are too small. Let me give you an example. We have folks who want to get all the information in their in the native language, for example, Koreans, but the benchmark to actually be covered by the language provisions of the Voting Rights Act is you have to have 10,000 limited English proficient individuals who are eligible to register to vote. That means people who are citizens and 18 or over. Well, the census says that Koreans only have about 12,000 total, about 12,000 people here in Harris County. Overall, the population is only like 13,000. So the population is too small, because when you actually think about how many of those are actually eligible to vote, of those 12,000, it brings the number down. And then of the people who actually are eligible to vote or registered to vote, how many of those are actually are limited English proficient? So it keeps making the number smaller and smaller. So it's you have to wait till your population grows probably till about 20,000 plus for you to be even be able to actually meet the 10,000 citizen voting age population who are limited English proficient to be able to qualify for to be covered by the language provisions of the Voting Rights Act. So the point is that these language minority groups are just too small, that the census doesn't conduct analysis of those populations, because the numbers are just too small. I think they have to comprise about 5%. for the census to actually take a
Right.
look. Yeah. So it's yeah, and they're very diverse. One of the things that I found, and I quickly have always paid attention to, that there's always certain groups that have this perspective that if they just get more people to vote from all of these groups, that they're going to be on voters, they're voters, that somehow that the people that are not voting are all going to be either on the left or on the right. And I'm not sure that's actually accurate. And there's also a narrative that has been carried out since I did some research and read and found that 1968 presidential election was the first election where the African American community voted in large percentages for the Democratic Party, 88%. And I believe that because folks who are not minorities, that they looked at Hispanics as an emerging population, and they just assumed that Hispanics were going to vote at the same level for one party as the African American community, who tends to be the most loyal voters for the Democratic Party. And as it turns out, the Hispanics have a different history, and the diversity of the recent immigrants within the last 30, 40 years is increasing. The diversity of the Hispanic community, not just here in Houston, but across the nation, makes it very difficult for them to be able to respond, or a message to resonate among all of them. It's a challenge. People need to do more research to figure out how to convince them that to go one way or another.
Well, thank you. We have time now to go back to each of our speakers for what is perhaps the most challenging question, which really is to try to help us as ethnic media to know how to cover this very diverse and complicated landscape of voters. And Renee, you and in fact, all our speakers have referenced the impact of gerrymandered districts, which tend to discourage competition and therefore discourage turnout. The presidential elections in 2024, November, may overcome this discouragement at the state level. Alternatively, there's tremendous interest in the down ballot election. So I guess what should we be looking for as ethnic media in trends, long-term trends in ethnic voter turnout and its impact on Harris County, Houston, and overall Texas? And start with Renee.
Well, Harris County, and certainly Texas as a whole, is a majority minority entities. So our voters, are mostly of color, at least our potential voters. Our job is to make sure that we get the accurate, data-driven information out to those voters. And part of that is through local media, particularly when we're looking at those local elections. So I certainly invite any reporters to reach out to us. We are available. We can, do interviews or help with data collection or analysis. I feel like, any of us on this panel, as well as our colleagues at UH and UHD and TSU and Rice, should be used as resources.
That's a wonderful invitation. You will get a list of all the media that were on today's call, which we hope you'll also add to your communication outreach.
Right.
But that's terrific. So, Hector, what are you advising us to watch carefully so we avoid the mistake of buying into narrative as opposed to watching very specific data of registered citizen voters?
Probably just to follow up on what Renee said is that you have to do a little research. What we're doing right here. Yeah, reporters need to do some research pertaining to what has happened in the past to be able to place in context what happens in the future or what's happening now. If you actually did surname analysis of Spanish surnames, you would find that for every presidential election going back to 2004, when you track it, that the number of Spanish surname voters has grown. It has grown just because obviously the population has grown, the citizen voting age population has grown, but even the turnout has grown. Here in Harris County, the turnout in 2020 was 59% for Spanish surnames. Previous to the previous election, 2016, it was 53%, and before then, it was like 50%. So you see that you can actually, it's not a perfect science, but you can actually, you're using the same surname glossary that you used in 2004. You can track it, and you see that it's growing, and you would see that the picture that people paint is not as negative as people make it out to be. There's progress. There's progress that's taken place among minority language communities and engaging them and actually them coming out to vote. But in the end, we need to understand that what drives turnout is what's on the ballot, what's on top of the ballot. That determines what drives turnout.
Right. And Michael, our final speaker, you emphasized the importance of the younger voter turnout, and it's particularly relevant in the African American voter voting picture. Tell us your kind of what should we be watching for in especially the African American and younger African American vote? Michael, you're on mute. Sorry.
Okay, I apologize. I'm sorry.
Sure.
The universities. I was saying that I echo what both Renee and Hector were saying. We should be used as resources, in particular the universities. I think communications is very important. I think there are novel ways in terms of addressing the question of why do we hate each other so much in terms of voters, in terms of this partisan divide that we have. And we talked about redistricting. You guys should cover some of the alternatives. There are models out there in Ohio, for example, and it'd probably be a big stretch for me to be on here talking about a redistricting commission that is designed to take the hyperbolic partisanship out of it, where you have Republicans versus Democrats, just try to create fair maps. There are other election sources, and again, I don't want to get out here on a limb, but ranked choice voting is something that is not always.
We lost you, Michael.
Yeah, am I back?
Final 60-second pitch.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, my pitch. That was an Amber Alert. However, that's why I went off. But again, I was mentioning ranked choice voting is something that's used in other states. I'm not saying that would come to Texas soon, but what is it? Both of those things are designed to take the hyper partisanship and this divided government that we've seen in Congress over the last 2 years. Thank you.
We are so appreciative of this hour, which opens a window for us for not just today, but the long term. And as we consider how we're going to cover the 2024 elections, having this foundation of knowledge about how to identify who the voters are, where the trends are going, yes, there's been a decline, but when you look closely, as you said, the ballot issues determine the voter turnout, and there could be a turnaround. We don't know, but certainly nothing is fixed, everything is fluid, and you've helped us understand where we have to look, how we have to see this very complex voting landscape. We very much appreciate your time and offering to be ongoing sources for our media in this very important role of reporting on the elections. Thank you very, very much. And our conference is now closed.
अब तक के लिए इतना ही। देखते रहिए DTVNN और हमारा सिस्टर टीवी चैनल देसी टीवी USA, जहां पर आपको इंग्लिश, उर्दू, पंजाबी न्यूज़, बुलेटिन्स और एंटरटेनमेंट के हवाले से बहुत सारे प्रोग्राम्स देखने को मिलेंगे। तो बिल्कुल विजिट करना ना भूलिएगा और हमें रखिएगा अपनी दुआओं में याद। इसी के साथ दीजिएगा इजाज़त। अल्लाह हाफ़िज़।